Parliament may have been suspended, but it hasn't stopped politicians talking about Brexit or a possible election. DUP leader Arlene Foster is meeting with the Prime Minister today, and Jeremy Corbyn used his TUC speech as an opportunity to warn Mr Johnson that he's facing the biggest people-powered campaign ever. Well, joining us now from Westminster is the chief political commentator for the Indie, John Rentoul, and reporter for Guido Fawkes, Tom Harwood. Hello to you both, gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us on the programme this afternoon. John Rentoul, to you first of all. I was going to say age before beauty, but I'm not going to. Thoughts on the scenes from last night in the House of Commons?
Well, it was pretty rowdy stuff. I mean, the bottom line is that the Prime Minister is in a terrible bind for the next 5 weeks. He has very few choices open to him if Labour won't allow him to have an election. I mean, I did smile when I heard Jeremy Corbyn threatening Boris Johnson with an election soon, but he wasn't prepared to vote for it last night because Labour MPs know that they would lose it. So Boris Johnson's in a very difficult position. He only really has two options in the middle of October. One is to get a deal through the House of Commons at the last minute, and the other is to resign and then hope to fight an election as the Prime Minister who didn't actually ask for an extension to the Brexit deadline.
Tom, apart from the playground antics that we saw at the end of business yesterday, what else should those MPs be doing between now and the 14th of October or whatever to try to sort this mess out? Because it's not just incumbent on the Prime Minister, is it?
Well, I think actually, ironically, one of the reasons why it is such a mess in the first place is because MPs have been trying to get stuck in to these negotiations which are properly the duty of the executive to carry out. International negotiations can't happen by a group, by a committee, by a legislature. This isn't how things are done. It's not how things are done in any kind of country.
I get that, Tom, but should they not be taking the temperature of what's going on in their constituencies and coming back with that information for the Prime Minister?
Well, ironically, I think the Prime Minister's more in touch with constituents up and down this country than MPs are at the moment. We've seen this is probably the most out-of-touch House of Commons that has existed in many, many decades. This is a House of Commons that is so out of touch, it recognises that it's out of touch, and that's why it keeps refusing repeatedly to have an election, because most of the members know that really they're not speaking for their constituents. They know that in the last election, they told their constituents that they'd do certain things, that they'd respect the result of the referendum, that they wouldn't try and hinder it. And yet, in so many cases, they have gone back on those promises that they made to their constituencies. In many cases, MPs have actually jumped parties without by-elections, without the consent of their electors. So really what we're facing now is a situation of politicians against the people. And from where I'm sitting, an election can't come soon enough.
John, what do you think? What should the Prime Minister be doing over the next 5 weeks? And what should the other members of the House of Commons be doing? Because otherwise, we're going to find ourselves on the 31st of October, probably won't be leaving. We'll have another day to the 31st of January and, you know, kicking the can down the road. Oh, no, I've used that phrase I'm not supposed to. Again and again.
I think that's on the banned list, Kate.
It is.
I think... No, I mean, you're absolutely right. I do think it will be very, very bad for British democracy to postpone Brexit again, but I don't see any way out of that unless, over the next 5 weeks, Boris Johnson can negotiate a new Brexit deal. I mean, it would have to be sufficiently different from what Theresa May negotiated to get it through the House of Commons when they come back on the 14th of October. But then he'll have very, very little time because there'll be the European Summit on the 17th and 18th of October, and then the 19th of October is the deadline set in the legislation that was given the royal assent yesterday, which would require him to send that letter asking for an extension if Parliament hasn't passed a deal by the 19th of October.
What do you think, Tom?
Well, of course, Boris Johnson has said he would never ever send that letter. He'd rather be dead in a ditch, to use his words, than to ask for yet another extension, than another pointless delay that costs £1 billion a month. This is clear. It's pretty clear what Number 10 are saying and what they're going to do. They would never ask for an extension. They're going to try and find a way to, within the law, sort of find a loophole within the legislation that received royal assent this week. They're going to see if they can leave come what may on the 31st of October. I still think it's more likely than not that we'll leave at the end of October. Whether that's without a deal or preferably with a deal, Number 10 are pretty clear, and this is a very activist, quite a maverick Number 10, who feel like they can find a loophole, who feel like they can find a way to deliver Brexit come what may. And that is going to make the European Union side of the negotiations all the more interested in achieving a deal, because it's in everyone's interests to achieve a clear deal, and the EU can clearly see that Theresa May's deal would never get the votes in Parliament, and if they're going to stick belligerently to their lines, that's a clear way that we're going to end up with no deal as the situation that no one wants to see, but through the EU's belligerence would come to pass.
What do you think, John?
I don't think that's quite right. I mean, Boris Johnson has tried every trick in the book so far to try and get round the fact that there's a majority in Parliament that doesn't want a no-deal Brexit, and so far everything has failed. And if over the next 5 weeks his brilliant strategic geniuses in Number 10 can find a loophole in the legislation that has just been passed, then good luck to them. But I mean, Parliament will be sitting at the end of October, and if Boris Johnson finds a way round that legislation, Parliament will just pass some more legislation in order to ensure that we do not leave at the end of October with no deal. I don't think there's any way around that apart from passing a deal or Boris Johnson resigning. Now, obviously, personally, I'd prefer him to pass a deal. I thought Theresa May's deal was a sensible compromise. Tom thought it was a surrender treaty. But I think a surrender treaty is probably the only thing that Parliament is going to be capable of passing, unless we end up with endless delay, which I think would be terrible for democracy.
I quite agree with you on the endless delay. It's expensive, it's anti-democratic, no one wants to see it, it doesn't help a single person in this country. But there is a difference in terms of when MPs come back after this conference recess, after the new Queen's speech in October. And that's just last week. Number 10 stood down in the Lords. They didn't choose to sort of do their filibustering plan. They chose to stand down and not carry that out and not try and talk out the bill. And that's clearly because they have another sort of idea in terms of how they can deliver Brexit with this bill on the statute books. So it's going to be a different situation in October, because there are other things that haven't been tried yet that Number 10 could do to stop new legislation coming to pass.
Yeah, but again, I make the point to both of you, gentlemen. I'd be interested to know what you think. I'm sure our viewers at home are thinking, what, they've got 5 weeks now. Are they, what, they're just going to be kicking their heels? Are they just running down the clock? What on earth's going on, John?
Well, Boris Johnson's probably going to open a few fates. He might go and visit some police academies. I mean, who knows? I mean, to be serious, there are party conferences, and Boris Johnson's got some foreign engagements. He's got to go to the UN, will probably meet Donald Trump. But I mean, the only important thing in those 5 weeks is to negotiate with the EU to produce a form of words that is capable of getting through Parliament, because otherwise there'll be, it'll just be more time wasted. And I'm sure Tom, is very confident that Number 10's got some kind of secret gee whiz plan to sort everything out at the last minute. But so far, every cunning plan brought forward by the geniuses of Number 10 has blown up in their faces, and I don't think anything different is going to happen. I mean, I think there are no sort of shortcuts in this. Parliament either has to pass a deal or we have to go to an election and sort it out.
I think this all ends in an election. That's clearly the sort of end game here, and it can't be avoided, no matter how much the Labour Party want to kick the can down the road, to use that phrase that we all hate using so much. But what is quite clear, and I think what a lot of people have been missing really about the Number 10 strategy, is it's not talking to sort of the SW1 bubble. It's not talking to Westminster. It's talking to the wider country. And if we look at if we take a step back from the political fray and the mayhem and all the nonsense that's been going on in Parliament, Parliament, actually the Conservative Party has been building a pretty steady lead above the other parties. And so when that election does come, it will be a pretty seismic clear out of Parliament, and people will finally get that sort of Brexit election that has never really happened. 2017 was never a Brexit election, no matter how much Remainers want to paint it like that. It was clearly an election fought on issues like policing and social care, and the less that we talked about Brexit, the worse the Conservatives were doing. The next election is not going to be able to avoid being a Brexit election, and that's going to pay massive electoral dividends to the Conservative Party. Ultimately, that's how you fix this rut. The rut has been created by a Parliament that has gone back on its promises, a Parliament that is so finely balanced that all votes are almost unwinnable. We always get this sort of sense of crisis when there's a hung Parliament, when no one can command a clear majority in Parliament. That's when political chaos arises. It's not so much to do with the Brexit situation, which of course would be sorted if Boris Johnson had a thumping majority. We all know that. So let's stop pretending that the issue here is some sort of intractable Brexit quagmire. It's a parliamentary quagmire. It's the fault of MPs not getting behind the Prime Minister. And so when we have a Parliament that when we have a government that has a decent majority in Parliament, that's when we'll see stability and safety, really, for the country going into the future.
But, Tom, a general election, I'll come back to you in a second, John. Tom, a general election won't necessarily deliver that.
No, that's very true, and I think Number 10 have been at pains to say that this is not going to be an easy walk-it sort of thing. But I think all of the signs that we've seen in polling have pointed to that way. There has been a steady lead built up, and issues have been
according to the latest poll
highlighted
from the former
by
Number 10
Number 10
advisor.
Well, yeah, these are internal polls rather than external polls, and I think we should always take internal polls that have perhaps conveniently leaked with a pinch of salt.
OK, poll schmoles, John.
Well, I do think, I mean, Tom's blue-tinted spectacle scenario contains the problem, which is that if the Conservatives look as if they're going to win this general election, then Labour MPs aren't going to vote for it. I mean, I've got this sort of nightmare vision of Labour MPs never voting for a general election because they always are likely to fear losing it. So we could end up in the worst of all possible worlds, endless Brexit delay, a completely powerless government, and a parliament that absolutely refuses to dissolve itself. And then what happens? I mean, I think MPs have to take some kind of responsibility. I mean, I think they got away with it this week. I think Labour's pretense that they wanted an election but didn't want to vote for it now was ridiculous, and I think at some point MPs are going to have to take some responsibility for the situation and going to have to decide something. OK, almost out of time, guys. Just a quick thought from both of you. When's the general election going to be, Tom?
I think it will be before Christmas.
Oh, shucks. John?
2033.
It's good to talk to both of you. Thanks very much indeed. When do you think the general election is going to be?